Kenya is seeking to raise $60 billion, which is approximately 8.4 trillion shillings, for climate adaptation and mitigation over the next 7 years. This is mainly anchored on collaboration with the private sector to scale up adaptation financing to support communities invest more in renewable energy. Wairimu Njenga had a discussion about expanding clean energy across the country with Brian Omenyi, the coordinator of the Sustainable Energy Access Forum Kenya. And this is how the conversation went.
Well, thank you for joining us, Cynthia Nyamai, right here as we discuss renewable energy. And as you very well know, Kenya has been ranked top when it comes to use of renewable and clean energy in the Horn of Africa, helping mitigate effects of climate change. And the government has been aspiring for universal access to electricity for all by the year 2030. And to expound more on that, I am joined by Brian Omenyi, who is the coordinator for Sustainable Energy Access Forum for Kenya, and also Florence Gishora, who is the Communication Manager, Access Coalition. Now, thank you for joining us. Now, we can start from whether Kenya is on course when it comes to achieving the 100% transition to clean energy by the year 2030.
Thank you so much. So, as you've rightly put it, the President has pronounced himself clearly on the need for Kenya to transition to 100% clean energy, and the target is to do this by 2030. As a country, we're looking at the latest statistics at Kenya having electricity connectivity of 77%. Out of this, the generation of electricity in Kenya is 92% renewable. So looking at this, then the gap is about 8%. So 8% is, of course, well achievable, but of course there's a difference that we need to also look at. The electricity generation is 92% green, but then in terms of consumption, you look at Kenya is there's a heavy reliance on fossil fuels, which is really the major energy source for the transport industry, for manufacturing, for different sectors that are heavily relying on fossil fuels, mostly for energy access. So then that creates a big gap for us. To be able to achieve this, we have seen a lot of efforts to introduce, for instance, electric vehicles in the country, which is a very good move. So of course there is need to create an environment whereby that is going to support this venture. For instance, we don't have enough charging stations that can support these electric vehicles. So those are some of the infrastructure-wise, those are some of the gaps that are hindering this process. Also in terms of policy, I think as a country we have not yet been able to come up with policies that are going to help us to transition there. So in terms of transitioning to green and renewable energy in the manufacturing sector, it's quite a big gap because most of the industries are being powered by fossil fuels. So we've seen some few companies try to put up solar grids to be able to access energy. This is because electricity is quite unreliable, and of course the high costs that come with it. So there are some baby steps I can say we are making that are towards helping us to transition. But of course, with the right commitment that we have seen from the presidency and the environment that we require that can help us to be able to attract investments in renewable energy, then there is hope that by 2030 we can achieve the 100% transition that we're looking at.
We are leading in geothermal energy, in wind energy, but when it comes to private financing, that's a big challenge. And there's a need for all stakeholders, especially private financing, the multilateral development banks, the government, to come together in putting money for this kitty so that we can have 100 transition. 2030 is just around the corner, and if everyone does not put the money there, then we may leave some behind, and we need to transition for all so that we can have great success and meet the targets that Kenya has committed to meet.
There have been calls, and I know it's something that you guys have been talking about, calls for increased adaptation, financing in energy access. I'd like you to elaborate more on that. What do you mean by climate adaptation and mitigation?
These are some of the terms that people feel like it's jargon when you're talking about climate change. So basically, when you're talking about climate mitigation, we're looking at measures and efforts that are geared towards reducing emissions. So for instance, when we're talking about tree growing, trees are carbon sinks, and you know carbon is one of the major greenhouse gas that is in the atmosphere. So when we grow more trees, then it's going to absorb carbon in the food process, the science we learned in primary school. That helps in taking away more carbon from the atmosphere, and then it reduces the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which in the long run contributes to addressing and mitigating climate change. It's trying to curb those actions that contribute to emissions, which is the greatest contributor to climate change. When you're talking about adaptation, you're looking at accepting that climate change is here with us, and therefore coming up with coping mechanisms that are going to enable the communities that are already experiencing the impacts to adjust and be able to live with it, because life has to continue. So how do we ensure that our communities are resilient enough so that climate change does not overweigh them? So when you're talking about financing, the challenge we have in the country is Kenya. For us, mitigation is not a challenge because, as you said, 92% of for instance, our electricity is coming from the grid. Our emissions are almost negligible. The whole of Africa contributes about 4.2%. So that tells you in Africa, mitigation is not a big challenge, but adaptation is. But we've seen most of the investments coming into the country are directed towards mitigation. And this is because most of the developed countries are the ones who emit more. So they emit more and surpass the targets which are laid. When you look at the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, there are targets, thresholds that have been given to countries. So because they surpass those thresholds, they are investing more in developing countries in carbon credits and the likes, so that they can be able to compensate the targets they have surpassed. That's why we're seeing more investments in mitigation coming into the country. Then this bring the aspect that there's no goodwill for these developed countries to support adaptation in the country. That's why we've seen the $100 billion that was committed in 2021, when the Paris Agreement came into action. They have not been able to fulfill it because for them, adaptation is not a big challenge. They have the economies which are resilient, which can enable them to recover from the impacts of climate change. So for us as Kenya, we are calling to the international bodies, the developed countries, the international banks. How do we scale up adaptation? Because that is our major challenge. How do we put energy access at the heart of it? Because when we're talking about pollution and emission of gases, it's because people want to access energy. If it's emissions from the fossil fuels, from the factories, from the transport sector, all that, it's because people want to access energy. So if we are able to invest more in adaptation, support our communities to be able to invest more in renewable energy access, support investments in solar, wind, and all that, then it's going to enable us to address the actual challenges we face, because to support them to adapt better and not to be, pushed beyond limits by the adverse impacts of climate change.
In addition to that, about financing adaptation, so when you look at a sector like agriculture, it's heavily on adaptation, and agriculture is like the backbone of our country's economy. I think it contributes to around 30% of our GDP. Yet the financing from outside, from international directly to agriculture, it's very minimal, and still the public financing, the budget allocation, like the other day the finance bill went through, and I guarantee you, I think in the past 5 years the allocation to agriculture, it's always less than 5%. Yet Kenya is a signatory to one of the continental instruments like the Malabo Protocol, where countries are supposed to finance more than 10%. So you find that the financing of adaptation, it's not just with the international powers, but also in the Kenyan government in terms of budget allocation, and also going to the counties. agriculture is a devolved function. What's the percentage of the county's allocation to that? And energy is an enabler. So when we look at issues, opportunities like solar powered irrigation and other avenues and other productive uses that can be used for on energy in some of these sectors, it has been quite marginalized. It has been left to the private sector or investors who invest ad hocly without a systematic way. So there's more opportunity in terms of financing, and I think moving forward with this campaign, there are opportunities for that. Yeah, bringing everyone to the table. Yeah.
Let's talk about the campaign. Power Up. What is Power Up?
It's a campaign which has started in Kenya, which brings about stakeholders together. We've raised 9 key policy asks to the government, and we believe if the government was to be able to follow through some of these policy asks, we'll be able to achieve our set targets on SDG 7 by 2030. And SDG 7, to our viewers, it's a goal on energy, clean energy access that is reliable and affordable for all people. So we brought in, we have the government, we have civil society organizations like myself and Brian, we have startups, companies, and we are hoping when we coalesce together in this advocacy, we'll be able to achieve the set targets we've set here.
We have already come up with about 9 asks, which we are going to use to engage different stakeholders, mostly targeting government. So the asks are geared towards how do we, for instance, support the government in addressing or achieving the implementation of the NDC targets. NDC is the nationally determined contributions. In its revised submission to the UNFCCC in 2020, Kenya raised its ambition to emit from 30% to 32% by 2030. So that's a very ambitious target that the government seeks to do that. And in order to achieve this, it seeks to raise about $60 billion. $43 billion going towards adaptation, and about 17.5 billion going to mitigation. So how do we then get sufficient investments to ensure that we realize these resources that are going to help us to achieve the targets that have been set? The other policy ask we have within the campaign is looking at spearing public-private partnerships. One of the challenges we have in the country is government working on its own, the private sector working on its own. Of course, the private sector is more into profits, government is more into public well-being and all that. Of course, all of them have the public well-being in mind. So how do we bridge the gap between the public and the private sector so that they can be able to collaborate more? Because when you look at the government, it cannot do everything. So it needs the private sector, for instance, who are the enablers. They're the ones who are directly manufacturing the products that we want to, the technologies we want to help us to support in the emission reduction targets. They're the ones who are doing the supplying, distribution, marketing of all these products. How do we have that collaboration? The private sector are also the ones who have the financial muscles. When looking at the banks, whether at the regional level, at the country level, even going down to the community level, the circles that we have. How do we engage with these different private institutions to ensure that we are able to get the resources, be it through grants, be it loans, that can help us to transition well. The other policy ask we are looking at is how do we come up with tailored skill training programs to be able to empower our local people with technical skills and knowledge on how, for instance, to operate renewable energy related technologies, how to produce these technologies locally, so that we don't have to rely on importing the technologies outside the country, most of which we've seen complaints of people getting substandard products which do not address the challenges we have, and they are also quite expensive. So how do we grow the local capacity to enable us to have the right technologies that we need? The other aspect, of course, we're looking at creating awareness. Most of our communities are not really utilizing energy as it's supposed to be. You have one of the reasons why the cost of electricity is high in Kenya is because not that we don't produce enough electricity. Actually, we produce more electricity than we need. The problem is that people are not able to consume. So KPLC is running into losses. And to cover that extra energy or electricity they have produced, they have to increase the cost so that they cover that up. So how do we empower our communities to venture into productive uses of energy for economic purposes, so that you just don't sit in the house and use electricity for lighting and powering maybe your TV and charging your phone, but you can use it to cook, which is cheaper. Through statistics, it's been found actually electric cooking is even cheaper way than LPG and the other sources that we are looking at. How do we support our communities to use appliances such as solar dryers for maybe produce like fish for the fishing community, using coolers and refrigerators for farming communities, maybe those who produce milk, those who are perishable goods. How do we enhance that so that they are able to invest more in these technologies that are able to sustain their businesses? So we are looking at creating awareness on issues of productive uses of energy. The other policy aspect we're looking at is on engaging governments to give us incentives and subsidies. So we are calling for like a 10-year incentive break, which will, for us, we believe it's going to create a conducive environment to support uptake of these renewable technologies that we are talking about. So from one of the studies we were looking at, when we had the exemption in 2021, we had a growth of in a period of 3 years, we had a growth of from 5% to 26% in terms of the uptake of solar power water pumps. So you see, in a period of 3 years, we have been able to grow about 19%. So what you can imagine what a period of 10 years will help us to do, because then the products are going to be easily accessible, affordable to the communities, and therefore easy for uptake, and they're providing quite good alternatives to off-grid communities who do not have access to the grid connectivity.
In short, you're calling for tax rebates, investment in energy technologies, and as well as subsidies, among others.
Promoting the uptake of these renewable energy sources, then we are trying to bridge that gap of about 25 to 30% of the communities that still do not have electricity access. And of course, when you're looking at these communities, there are quite so many other challenges. The reliability of the grid connectivity. You go to a community where a transformer is faulty and they go for a month or two without somebody coming to rectify the problem. So a month without electricity in this current economy is something big. There is somebody who has a barber shop, a salon, who entirely depends on that electricity. So when they go for a month, then it's become something else. But we've seen some of these small-scale businesses, MSMEs, taking up these solutions as alternatives to power when the grid is not reliable. At the same time, the grid also can't go everywhere. Sometimes there are so many challenges like the terrain and all that, security. So when you have these off-grid solutions like the renewable energy sources we're talking about, the solar and the likes, then the communities also have the control of the whatever they are using, so that they don't run into some of these challenges like the high cost that you're talking about.
Maybe you can speak on the legal and regulatory framework and how the government is adapting to this aspect of power up, empowering rural growth and climate adaptation in Kenya.
I think it's more of partnerships, and this is on two levels, from the county government, the two levels of government, the county governments and the national government, so that they can explore opportunities on those diverse energy systems. He had mentioned about different sources of renewable energies, because it's not possible to connect each and every sector, but there can be learnings, because in terms of demand and supply, it's different from county to county and from areas to areas because of the different activities. One, it's, for instance, you could have a region that is heavily on agriculture. So, of course, in terms of the investments on adaptation systems, it may work there. There are other areas which are a bit arid, so the interventions may be a bit different. So I would say it's by case sector, but it's a case by case scenario. But the goal is, and what we are pushing for, it's having all these stakeholders in one table and having systematic planning and interventions for those different sectors. That's the only way that will enable everybody is included in energy access. Otherwise, if everything is done, for instance, only at the national level and it's not cascaded down to the counties, and or when it's cascaded down to the counties, they don't involve other stakeholders. We have the investors, we have the financiers, we have even the learning institutions like the TVETs. Then it may take us a longer time to achieve the targets that we have set. Yeah.
Thank you, Florence. Well, that has been conversation on driving green investment into the country, as you've heard there from Brian Omenyi, who is a coordinator for Sustainable Energy Access Forum here in the country, and also from Florence Gishoya, who is a communication manager, Access Coalition. Back to you in studio. My name is Wairimu Njenga.